Accept the fact that every given day you're going to have 10,000 balls in the air and most of them are going to drop. And that's okay. You pick your battles, you pick them well, you stay focused, and you stay in control. And if you are too distracted, you're going to be putting too much burden on yourself, and then you end up burning out.
Okay, so I want to jump back into the Silicon Valley piece. I've done conversations like this in places like Berlin, Stockholm, Hong Kong, Beijing, and Silicon Valley always comes up early in the conversation because people around the world mythologize this thing that is Silicon Valley. You know, they imagine it's a land of unicorns just running through golden fields. So people on the panel, tell us about what your experience in Silicon Valley has been and kind of what it means to you, both as something concrete, something abstract, something aspirational.
I'm happiest. Do it. So I see two sides to Silicon Valley. Okay, so there's an amazing element to it, right? You've got a whole droves and droves of entrepreneurs and investors. It's a great place to kind of build things. You just sort of there's a natural orientation to create. And to take risk and to make things happen. There's a real innovation, natural set of innovation that exists there. And obviously all the components that are required to make that happen. Clearly, many of some of the great, well, let me be careful about this. A lot of great kind of pushes around the need to innovate in areas are starting there, okay? Then we give you the other side, which is it's a gigantic, like a fishbowl. Everyone's in this place, and they're all kind of buying their own around what's really going on in the world. There's, by the way, really, really smart people, really, really capable, but you know, there are stretches of time where you know you hear the language, some of the terminology and the language. Everyone's sort of saying the same thing and doing the same thing. This is the big thing, or this is the big thing. It's you know, we're getting better. Well, I'm hearing better stuff from Silicon Valley around more practical business, like applications coming out. Applications meaning more innovations that are more applicable in the real world. But for a long time, there was only so many photo sharing apps you could have, or you know, other kind of consumer technologies that could only get you so far, but everyone thought that they were the greatest thing in the world. So I think it's expanding and evolving, but there are times where you can just bang your head against a wall and wonder what's going on there. So it's a bit surreal. If you spend any time down there, it's a bit surreal, and good to know both sides, the good and the don't get lost in it.
I'd echo that. I felt like I was literally in a sitcom where like every person you meet, you're like, oh, you're that character from Silicon Valley. Or it's amazing because there's such extreme personalities, right? It's we know that startup entrepreneur type personalities aren't the norm, but in Silicon Valley it sort of is. So it's this like weird ecosystem. And I really appreciate what Jamie said. I feel like, you know, for us, we're looking at everyday Canadians, sort of like middle-class Canadians who are carrying credit card debt. And it would be very easy for us to try to develop a product, I think, if we were down there, that would appeal to what we think is like the normal person, which if you're in that system, it's not. Like, people don't care about the latest app or the best website. Like, we need to be able to produce a product that like someone living, I'm not going to throw a town name out there because I don't want to offend anything, but you know, like a regular person who's, you know, our average customer is 40 years old and, you know, has a regular income. They're not your, you know, hip, cool, Snapchatting 23-year-old millennials. So I think there's something about coming back to Toronto and coming back to Canada that was like, okay, this is more like real life. And this is where I can actually interact with who my customer is rather than being in this sort of weird sitcom Silicon Valley.
Which is really interesting because within our own country, Canada, there are people who think that Toronto is off the charts just like we think Silicon Valley is. And then they go back to whatever city they're in and say, now I'm back in the real Canada. We don't have the ideals that people in Toronto do. Ben, you've been a remarkably outspoken advocate of doing business in Toronto. And we've talked together and publicly about the myths of Silicon Valley. What do you think about this?
Listen, I personally love going down there, and I love the connections and the network that we have down there. I'm down there quite a bit. I'm also in New York quite a bit, or in London, or in other places around the world. And you take your little pieces from each of them. The beauty is that we don't have that echo chamber here necessarily, where we can have a little bit more of an objective view and just take the pieces that we want. I think it's the same thing as anywhere, just getting good balance. But there are very special things that go on down there that don't happen anywhere else in the world. So to ignore it is, you do so at your own peril, I think, if you're in the technology world. If you get caught up in it, you do so at your own peril as well. So I still think that this gives us the best vantage point by doing it here in Toronto.
How well, here in Toronto, or whatever your home community is, do you think that we in the startup world take care of our own when it comes to mental health issues?
I think the best help that I've received has actually been by having a strong network and talking to people who've been there or done that and being able to have a frank conversation. I know that, for example, Aron would be one of those people in my network where if things not going right, I don't have to feed him a line of shit. I can be straight up with him and saying, dude, this is what's going on. And being able to know that I don't have to play a facade and I don't have to kind of pretend it's something that it's not. He gets it and my network gets it. And spending years, and every time you're out networking, it's about making sure you're finding people that truly understand that. Because when you have people that understand that and you can actually reflect and bounce on them, that is a significant help. The second part of that, though, is really being able to take that opportunity to look after yourself. Accept the limitations. Accept the fact that every given day you're going to have 10,000 balls in the air and most of them are going to drop. And that's okay. You pick your battles, you pick them well, you stay focused, and you stay in control. And if you are too distracted, you're going to be putting too much burden on yourself, and then you end up burning out.
If you really want to have better mental health, don't become an entrepreneur in the first place. I mean, I'm not trying to make light of the thing. But there's a reality of what it is, which is it's hard, it's intense, it's intense and it's overwhelming a lot of the time. It really is, and everything, remember, comes back to you, right? From I refer to things like staring into the abyss, right? The number of times I've looked out into the world and thought there may not be a tomorrow with respect to business, and it is just business. But it doesn't feel like that at the time. It feels like a lot more than that because you put so much into it. And so it is an intense thing, and I totally agree. You need to find other people around you who've been there, because only people who've been there can actually understand and appreciate what it's like to go through it. One other thing, I mean, if you can, if you don't have, if you have family, if your family isn't on board when you go and do this, don't do it. Because that's the other thing, is that you need to have the people who are closest to you on board with the decision and go along with you on this journey. It's a journey. It's a journey that's got highs and lows, right? So it's like a constant roller coaster, a very, very extreme roller coaster, and they've got to be with you when it's high and they got to be with you when it's low, which is another thing that's key. And so that's the other thing I would look for.
And part of this notion of failure, which again ties into kind of this Silicon Valley-based mythology. Failure and emotional health and mental health are so deeply intertwined. And there are some entrepreneurs around the world who mythologize failure and how great failure is. And I can tell you this as an entrepreneur, I think everybody on the panel would agree with me. Number one, failure sucks. Number two, you don't actually learn from failure. You know what you learn from failure? That it sucks and I don't want to do it again. And we can't help but personalize the failures we all have in our businesses because they're businesses that we built. And it's a core part of us. Ben, do you want to add anything?
No, listen, I actually have a really hard time with this topic because it's a really, really hard one. And I don't think that people are super honest about it, specifically when you're trying to run a business and people are looking up to you or people are, you're talking to, think that things are successful and they're wonderful. It really sucks. Like, it's wonderful and it looks good. It sucks. It's a terrible job, and I'm very lucky that I get to do it. I get that. And this isn't like a pity party, but it's terrible. And most of you shouldn't do it. I probably shouldn't do it either, but like, it hurts a lot of the time. It hurts probably 99% of the time. And maybe there's a couple minutes a day that are fun. But when you talk about it being business, it's more than business. You know, I actually had a little bit of like a rage fit for a moment when I heard about taking like funding money, and like chances are you guys shouldn't take money either. Like it's somebody else's money. You take their money, it's another human that's investing in you, in your stuff, in your story. Not even in what you've done. It's in your story. You're gonna let those people down potentially, and like you do that all the time. And you have employees. Those are people who are following you, just like hanging on your word because you told them to do that. That's a really, really hard thing. Those employees, they all have families. There's like kids that are dependent on your story that you told. Not that you've done anything yet, just on your story. So like, I get that you're giggling. I'm being unbelievably honest. Like, it is a terrible thing. And if you're on, you always have to be on. And when you go out for dinner with your family, you've got those wonderful family dinners, you can hear your family talking, but all you think about is like your cap table. And all you think about is how you're going to do your next deal because you can't turn it off. And you feel unbelievably guilty. You know, I started this and I just had like a newborn baby boy. And now I have a 4-year-old boy and a 2-year-old daughter. And I catch myself because I'll be up with them in the middle of the night and I'll be thinking about work while I'm like holding them. And it's a guilty, guilty, terrible, terrible feeling. So if you're not up for it, and chances are you won't even know about it, so it hits you like a ton of bricks because you don't realize like that this is actually how it happens, and probably happens with almost everybody here for the most part. But it's a very, very difficult thing to the point like it is not fun, and you are not happy doing it. And it's okay, but just know that that's what you're getting into, because if you don't know that, you're going to be surprised. It's going to hit you like a hammer, and bad, bad things are going to happen.
And, you know, it's great. We'll get to the questions now.
Awesome.
That was awesome. And, you know, it's fine, and it's great that people are giggling, but as Ben is telling his story, like shivers are going up my back because I remember being a startup CEO, and I was terrible at it. And the worst thing about being the CEO is when you're sitting there and you're having cold sweats in the middle of the night because you realize how many mortgages you're paying. And when you mess up the next day, how many jobs you're putting at risk. So you all came to a room like this tonight and are watching us online because you're looking for advice on how to do a startup, on how to build a company. And around that, over the years, builds up this thing called startup culture. And I've been of the opinion for a long time that startup culture is very badly broken. And I think that one of the reasons that startup culture is broken is because there's a lot of snake oil salesmen. And actually, I think it's salesmen, not salespeople. But most of them are salesmen who are out there making startup culture worse. What does the panel think about the state of startup culture in 2016? And if it's broken, how do people like everybody in this room go about fixing it?
I mean, one of the things I think is the whole sort of concept of work-life balance. Like most people think, oh, if you work at a startup, I feel like, Ben, you painted not an unfair picture of startup life, but a sort of fraction. I sort of think of startup life as like being a parent. Like a lot of it is awful, but people still choose to do it because like the highs are so great, right? The highs are high, and the majority of it is drudgery, but people still recommend to other people for some reason that you should go have kids because you sort of experience it. So I guess I want to caveat some of what Ben said, that yeah, it sucks a lot of the time, but there's like moments of fun and glory and like achieving something and like pushing yourself to your limits. Like, I don't know, I think like running a marathon doesn't sound like fun to me, but people do it, right? There's like lots of things that are challenging. But to your question, I do think there's an element where it can become all-encompassing, and I think there's an element of just like priorities that people have to realize. You mentioned, you know, family has to be supportive, and I think there's a flip side to that where it's like you still have to remember that you have to be supportive to your own family as well. And so I do think it's important to have some sort of balance. It feels a bit like you're running a marathon at like a sprint pace, and I think there's an element where you have to just be able to shut off. I know it's difficult to do that. Maybe I'm really good at compartmentalizing, which may or may not be good, but I really try to compartmentalize a bit of it and like turn off startup world, at least for like a couple hours while I'm spending time with my kids or whatever it is, and try and get a bit of perspective to stay sane.
So specifically about what's being perpetuated about it, well, I agree with Eva. I think Ben was a little hard on how bad it is, but he brought up a very good point, and that is the culture gets perpetuated by everyone saying startup, and the concepts are you're shooting fast, you're shooting, you know, you're cutting corners, you're just trying to move. You're a company. right? And you need to be making intelligent decisions. You have to make decisions based on fact and not just feeling. You have an obligation to everybody, and you need to start that as soon as possible and get that responsibility perpetuated throughout the organization, where you're milestone driven, that there is objectives, that people have deliverables, and they will be held accountable, whether it's just yourself, whether it's a team of 5 or a team of 50. It doesn't matter. And I think that actually is the biggest problem, is that startup means that you can change, you can do whatever you want on the fly. Sure, you're a little more nimble, you don't have a lot of the policies, but you still have to be responsible and accountable. And I think that's actually the thing that needs to be fixed. It's not just start something up in the basement and away you go. No, you're a company, and you got to do things right, and you got to have that professionalism about it. That's the one thing that I think is a bit broken.
And part of that responsibility to yourself and to your team and to others is when people say, how's it going? You're not always crushing it. You're not always killing it or using any of the other innumerable stupid startup cliches, that you're actually honest with people. When you and I have conversations about your company, yeah, as we did tonight, when you just came back from Europe, I'm like, how's it going? If you said I was crushing it, I'd be like, stop with like, how's it going? You've been away for a couple of weeks. What's going on?
Yeah.
I mean, I always go back to transparency. It's something that I just believe in. I will tell you that I spend at least 2/3 of the time when I'm interviewing someone to come on board, trying to talk them out of coming to work with us. And I tell them just how, but to Ben's point, like how bad it is, how challenging it is, how little we have in place, right? And so again, this is all relative. The point is that I just think it's really important that people are aware of what they're walking into, as opposed to the selling. Oh, it's all amazing, it's all good, we're all the way there. If you've told somebody, if you've told people and the people who are going to join you, this is what's really going on, this is what you're walking into, and then someone signs up for that, then that's fantastic. Then that's great. That means that's what they want, and they're fully prepared. They go in eyes wide open to that, and then you can live with yourself, and they can too. And I think what happens is you end up in an environment where people, there's no surprises, and it is what it is. But I totally agree with that. That whole like smile and it's all perfect all the time is just, that's one of the biggest problems in this thing. You're always selling. Well, sure you're selling, but be real.
Good evening, panel. My name is John. I'm the owner and founder of a local Toronto company called Urban Street Organics. My question is, do you see a push in the IT world or the corporate world for more sustainable programs, like using clean energy or waste diversion? Do you see that being more important, or is it still about the bottom line, making sure that your revenue grows?
Is it good to do the right thing for the environment? Is it good to do sustainable things? Of course. And from a practical perspective, just in terms of the way corporations think, is it good for my PR? Is it good for my bottom line? And so if you can tie what you're doing to those things, then you have both, right? So you're doing something good, and you're doing something that has a net pure benefit from a business perspective. I would always make sure that I had those I could always make sure that I could articulate or be clear about those benefits when I was talking to a customer.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for sharing your experience with us. My question is about dilution. I'm a founder of my company, and I have 5 guys in my team, and I don't pay them. And the question is, what chunk of my equity I should share with them? And question B is how I communicate my decision.
I want to know how you don't pay them, but anyways, I'll get it.
Yeah, there's something to learn here. This is good. I don't know that there's a right answer for this. Look, if the only way you have them on board is equity, right, then you want them to be highly incented to make sure that the business is a success, right? And so you can never sort of, when I say give enough, I mean, the point is it's better to be generous than not generous. And number one, and if it doesn't work out with somebody, it won't matter, because right, equity vests over time, they won't be around to you. I'm just a way to think about this. But the other piece in here, look, that I think is a good policy early on when you're starting to work with people. Try to be as transparent and as fair as possible early, because eventually there'll be other people. Someone's going to find, right, everyone talks. They all find out what everyone's doing. The last thing you want to do is start giving one person a lot more than somebody else, and you're going to end up in a lot of trouble. And I know at the time it doesn't, the time that you're doing it, there's logic that you're using, and there's a whole bunch of other things. Well, this person may be more valuable than this person. Just try to be as fair as possible and try to be as generous as possible.
Did you say they were employees or co-founders?
Yeah, they're more like co-founders,
okay,
but than employees, yeah.
There always needs to be, in my mind, there always needs to be one person who is the person. So you talk about being fair and equitable, that's great. Doesn't mean it's 20% across the 5 of you guys, right? There needs to be somebody who's in charge, for your employees as you start to grow. I feel there needs to be one person. When your investors are looking at somebody, they're looking for one person, like who is the person who's running this thing, whether it's operationally or back-end kind of equity piece of it. But have those conversations right away.
Yes.
Clearly define what you guys are doing and whose roles are what. And there needs to be one person who is the one who's in charge and has more equity.
And how to do it is transparently. You know, people love transparency. They want you to be honest with them, show them the cards that are on the table.
Mm-hmm. The problem, back to your answer, the problem is that it's very difficult to understand who deserves more and who deserves less. And either say, okay, guys, like this, you have 20%, and you're gonna share this 20% equally.
Make people earn it. Make people earn it over the years. Figure out an approach. It's hard to do when you don't know what the story is or what the roles are, but make people earn it out.
So very quickly, one of the things that I did is I set a chunk of the company up that was going to be distributed amongst all the employees, and they were all part of a founders club. One of the mistakes I made was I didn't have one person who was my right-hand man or woman. I didn't do that early on. And investors do ask that question. However, it was transparent. It was incentivized. It was clear. It was objective. It was transparent. We didn't have to get into minutia. Well, I have this skill and it does this. No, it actually, fine. You got one right-hand person who gets that. Everyone agrees. Everyone else, it's vested over time. Some people are going to go, and some of that cap is going to come back into the table. So very clear, very incentivized, very transparent.
All the questions are around dilution or like raising funding. Like, we should be clear that raising money probably in most cases isn't the right thing. Like, the vast majority of cases is not the right thing. And even if you do think that you have a business that you do need to raise money on, or you need some extra money to get you into like a cash flow positive position or a place where you can make some money, there are lots of other ways of getting cash than taking VC money or getting funding. So there is generating your own revenue. That would be pretty cool. If you can't do that, there's always debt. Then there's always angel and non-institutional. Then there's always other kind of programs. And other, like, there is a whole list of it. At the bottom of that, specifically in the early stage stuff, is pretty much institutional. Yet for some reason, we seem to be measuring all of the, hey, you know what? I have this idea, it may go somewhere, so maybe I'll go raise some funding and see what happens after that. What a ridiculous approach, guys. Like, this is really about, hey, if I really need cash to move forward, I have to reverse engineer this. As soon as you take money, you have a responsibility to make a lot of money on that money for people who are handing it to you. That is like, could be a car they're going to have, or it could be like their kids going to like summer camp or to school or putting food on their own table. And like, you have a responsibility, whether it's institutional investors or other investors. So think about what you want to do and what type of business that you want to run. And if you are taking a high-scale, high-growth company that requires some capital before you're able to hit that kind of cash flow positive piece, and I actually feel that if you take money, the second you take money, you actually almost have an obligation to IPO at some point, right? You need an exit. So if you're not thinking that, and we have an app or we have this, like, it is the wrong idea to say, we'll take a little bit of money and see what happens, or we'll raise funds. Like, it's a ridiculous approach. So I would really like hope that we don't do this as a community, to sit back and say, let's dabble, or let's use that as a way to keep score. I think we should really think about whether or not you're a fundable company or not first, and then figure out what the best way of making that money is so that you can get to that cash flow positive position and build a business. And every single person here has called their company a startup. Like, call it a company. It's not a startup. Just call it a company.
What do our panelists see as the future of ICT? What are the ideas, or some of the ideas that you have on trends?
I want to put something out there that is maybe aspirational. I don't necessarily see as a trend, but I really hope, and I say this is encouragement to mostly men in the room, that there are more women who are inspired to start up and found their own company. I feel like that's one of the things that was probably the biggest shock to me coming into the, sorry to use the word, but startup land, is like there are so many men and so few women. And so I'm going to aspirationally say I really hope that more women found their own companies.
I had a conversation with Aron earlier. We were talking about the whole legal tech, and when you compartmentalize and say, is this legal technology, is it med tech? It's actually, you've got industries that have ways of doing business. And if you can find something that makes that way of doing business, you don't necessarily have to be on the regulated side. Just something that actually can transfer across. A lot of big organizations and industries are starting to step away from the big all-encompassing applications like SAP and stuff like that to try to find a little more cohesive approach. And so I see that what will happen is you're going to see a lot of those opportunities will be those small little business improvements where it'll be platform-based, it'll be easily integrated, that tools will talk nicely to each other. I think you're gonna find also the big organizations are gonna start to become a little more accepting and learn how to deal with a startup. That's the big thing. They don't know how to deal with a startup. And so like what's happening with LegalX, Aron is trying to train big law firms, how do you work with a startup, right? And that is gonna be a significant trend across all the different sectors, I think.